Hello, I'm Dr. Amy Sturgis, and today it is my pleasure to make the case to you why you should read or reread a great dystopian series of the 21st century, The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins. Let's get started. I suspect some of you are already very familiar with the Hunger Games and the character of Katniss Everdeen, while others may be new to these stories. I have had the pleasure of reading and rereading the Hunger Games and teaching the Hunger Games at the undergraduate and graduate level, as well as writing about the series. And today I would like to share with you why I think now is the time either to discover or to revisit the books. Before I dive in, I should note the timing is very good, given that we're getting new insights into the Hunger Games story with Sunrise on the Reaping by Suzanne Collins, 2025. This is the second sequel novel to the Hunger Games trilogy, and it is set 24 years before the start of the first Hunger Games novel. That is, it depicts the 50th annual Hunger Games. Those of you familiar with the story will recall that this is the Hunger Games in which Hamish Abernathy represented District 12. The other books in the series include the Hunger Games trilogy, that's The Hunger Games from 2008, Catching Fire from 2009, and Mockingjay from 2010, centered on the heroic Katniss Everdeen, and a prequel set 64 years before the start of the trilogy, exploring the backstory of future President Coriolanus Snow. That's the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes from 2020. Together, they tell the story of a near-future dystopia set in a very recognizable North America. The nation that has arisen there, post-apocalypse, is Panem, made up of a wealthy capital and 12, once 13, districts, surviving in various states of poverty and despair under its iron control. So, given the new addition of a second prequel, the timing is ideal to visit or revisit the Hunger Games. And yes, it doesn't hurt that the books have to date inspired 5 excellent films from 2012 to 2023, 4 adapting the original trilogy of novels, and 1 adapting the first prequel, The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. I think these films are very successful in capturing the main characters and themes from the books, and they also stand on their own as powerful dystopian storytelling. But I am here to talk about the novels. If you liked the films, read the books. If you haven't seen the films, read the books. I can't say it enough. Read the books. I'd like to give you 3 main reasons why you should. First, the original trilogy tells a powerful, moving, relevant story with relatable, compelling characters about the nature of power and the need for resistance. The story of a young woman, Katniss Everdeen, one of so many from the districts meant to be used, chewed up, and spit out by the machine at the Capitol. But her story, one of her fierce loyalty to her family and community, and her reluctant embrace of rebellion against the larger oppressive system, and her growing awareness of the many ways power manipulates, seduces, and corrupts. Well, this story is as timely and relevant as it can be, given that it forces us to think about how we consume our news and entertainment without question or critical thought, how we are made passive and desensitized, how we feel helpless, and how we accept and are complicit in systems that manipulate and control us. Author Suzanne Collins has famously explained many times that the first sparks of the Hunger Games came to her as she was at home watching TV, flipping between news coverage of the war in the Middle East on one of the 24-hour news networks and reality television. Both were violent, over-sensationalized, and rather numbing to the senses, and she realized they kind of blurred together. What was reporting and what was entertainment? What was propaganda? What messages were these stories sending? And what were they asking the audience to do, or rather, not to do? It was difficult to know where reality TV ended and war began. And thus, The Hunger Games was born. Now is a perfect time to think of how we are receiving our news and our entertainment, what stories we question or blindly accept. And that brings me to my second point, the Hunger Games series as a call to action. And I do think it is a call to action. Isn't just relevant now, but it is also constructed from time-honored, important building blocks that interrogate the nature of power and resistance. Let me give you a few examples. Let's talk about Greece. In an interview with School Library Journal, Suzanne Collins said, quote, Theseus and the Minotaur is the classical setup for where the Hunger Games begins. You know, with the tale of Minos in Crete, end quote. So what is this Greek myth? Crete defeated Athens in battle. As a lasting reminder of Crete's power and dominion, King Minos insists that Athens' king send 7 young men and 7 young women of Athens, drawn by lots, to Crete as tributes to King Minos every year, or 7th or 9th year, depending on which version you read, as sacrifices. These young people are put in a labyrinth where a monster, the Minotaur, part man and part bull, devours them. The message, as Suzanne Collins says, is clear. Quote, we're going to do something far worse than kill you. We are going to kill your children, end quote. But then one day, a hero from Athens arrives in Crete, Theseus, and journeys to the center of the labyrinth with help from the king's beautiful daughter and slays the beast. The cycle is ended. No more tributes die. The Hunger Games trilogy is about a corrupt system that kills children in order to keep a population in check under its power, and how the heroine Katniss Everdeen helps to break that cycle. Now, I could talk all day about the Greek allusions and symbols and shout-outs in the Hunger Games, but for now, let's move on to Rome. Lots of visuals and imagery associated with Rome, sending the tributes out in chariots in the Hunger Games to be greeted by President Snow, not unlike we who are about to die salute you from the gladiators in the arena, for example. In that same interview with School Library Journal I referenced previously, Suzanne Collins said, quote, once the Hunger Games story takes off, I actually would say that the historical figure of Spartacus really becomes more of a model for the arc of the 3 books, for Katniss. We don't know a lot of details about his life, but there was this guy named Spartacus who was a gladiator who broke out of the arena and led a rebellion against an oppressive government that led to what is called the Third Servile War. He caused the Romans quite a bit of trouble, and ultimately he died. End quote. The fact Spartacus now is more legend than history, the idea a gladiator, or in Hunger Games terms, a tribute, could shake the system to its foundations. That's powerful. But how did the system get that way, to the point that Katniss will say, quote, if we burn, you burn with us, end quote? Well, there's another bit of Roman history. The land of Panem in the Hunger Games takes its name from the Latin panem et circenses, bread and circuses. This phrase comes from Satire 10 of the Roman satirist and poet Juvenal. In context, the Latin metaphor of bread and circuses identifies the only remaining interests of a new Roman population, people who no longer care for their historical right to political involvement. Why bother being involved? Why bother putting out effort to care for their political system and their rights? Roman politicians found they could buy these citizens simply by giving out cheap food and entertainment. Bread and circuses, in other words, was a most effective way for the ambitious to rise to power and to keep it, and thus the best way for political liberty in a republic to die. Here I'm going to quote, "Already long ago, from when we sold our vote to no man, the people have abdicated our duties. For the people who once upon a time handed out military command, high civil office, legions, everything, now restrains itself and anxiously hopes for just two things, bread and circuses." End quote. In the Hunger Games, Peeta and Katniss, who come from the impoverished and oppressed Appalachian-inspired District 12, learn that the capital citizens gorge themselves, force themselves to vomit, and then eat more, while people in the districts are starving. This is not unlike the Roman use of the vomitorium. The food that the capital citizens gorge themselves on, of course, that's the bread part. The circuses, well, that's the Hunger Games themselves. I've mentioned how Suzanne Collins uses Greek and Roman inspirations to build her interrogation of power, who wants it and how they keep it. But I also want to mention the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. This builds on more modern classics of political thought to ask how these corrupt systems come about. Is it nature, nurture, fallen human nature, broken human institutions? Where does the evil at the heart of authoritarian atrocity come from? There's a good reason why Suzanne Collins opens the novel with quotes from political philosophers, quotes that set up the big questions with which the novel wrestles. These show that the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes is in conversation and debate with political thinkers, theorists and essayists and novelists, who in turn were in conversation and debate with each other. She quotes from, among others, Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and a favorite of mine, a great political work, among many other things, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Who is the monster, and where does that monstrousness come from? So, just to recap, the Hunger Games books are not only a powerful, timely, and compelling read, but they channel classical and classic works, building on their interrogations of rights and responsibilities, power and resistance. And now, I'd like to share with you the number one reason I love the Hunger Games. Because many people are familiar with the Hunger Games, I will talk a bit more about its details here. So please be aware I'll be giving some specific examples from the books. A few spoilers are ahead. Here, I would like to draw on points I've made in my essay, His Fordship in the Capital and Big Brother in the Districts, the Hunger Games and the Modern Dystopian Tradition. And that's in the academic anthology, Critical Insights, The Hunger Games. My main argument is this. One of the most impressive and important aspects of Suzanne Collins' The Hunger Games is how it engages with the dystopian tradition of science fiction, takes part in its conversation, pays tribute to its classics, and responds to them, adding to the tradition, bringing something new to the table. In short, if you'd like both a masterful distillation of modern dystopian thought and an insightful answer to it, well, read The Hunger Games. 350 years after Sir Thomas More gave us the term utopia, in his 1518 work by the same name, another British philosopher, John Stuart Mill, in a speech on the state of Ireland before the House of Commons, identified those who supported a policy he opposed as dystopians because, quote, what they appear to favor is too bad to be practicable, end quote. Dystopia eventually became the accepted term for the answer to, hey, what's the worst that could happen? It's a dark destination we should strive to avoid. So dystopias imply a warning, And that's a hopeful thing, actually. To warn someone is to suggest there's still time to avoid going in the wrong direction. Dystopia is, in a way, as old as literature itself, depending on how we read it. Plato's Republic, after all, could be a dystopia. Certainly by the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, there were great works of dystopian science fiction. For example, British author H.G. Wells wrote The Time Machine and When the Sleeper Wakes. And the American Jack London wrote The Iron Heel. British E.M. Forster's The Machine Stops is a classic. The birth of a truly modern dystopian literary tradition, however, required one more ingredient, and that was the rise of the totalitarian nation state. So the parent text, I would say, of modern dystopia is we. The bloody Russian Revolution and resulting Soviet communism led to Yevgeny Zamyatin's pioneering We in 1924, a dystopian novel that would be banned in Zamyatin's home country of Russia for more than 60 years and earn its author permanent political exile. In his story, Zamyatin forecasts a dismal future extrapolated from political trends he witnessed firsthand. He imagines a powerful one state that dictates all aspects of human life, down to the number of times every person chews each bite of food. That same one state also seeks to expand its rigid and relentless control throughout the universe. It pioneers many of the essential building blocks that appear repeatedly in other works of dystopian storytelling, including The Hunger Games. Let me give you a couple of examples. Here's one illustration. Zamyatin conveys the dehumanization of the citizens of the one state by denying them names and designating them by numbers instead. Although the characters in The Hunger Games retain individual names, their home regions are not so fortunate. Katniss Everdeen hails not from the evocative Appalachia, but rather the sterile District 12. Moreover, once the games begin, the identities of tributes like Katniss and Peeta are directly tied to the number of the district they represent. In another instance of trend setting, Zamyatin depicts the constant surveillance conducted by the one state by describing the buildings of the future as constructed of transparent glass. Everyone, quite literally, is always watching everyone else, while the ruling benefactor presumably watches all. Similarly, in The Hunger Games, Katniss learns from an early age that as an ordinary citizen of District 12, she may be observed at any time, singing the wrong song in her home or wearing the wrong expression during a public announcement might be a costly mistake. After she volunteers as tribute, her life is transformed by the need to play to the ever-present cameras and the audience members behind them, and most importantly, of course, to President Snow, if she hopes to survive. Hope appears in We in the form of the forest beyond the walls of the one state, where a few survivors of the 200-year war manage to elude capture and live as part of the land. And the forest likewise symbolizes freedom and escape to Katniss in The Hunger Games, thanks to her late father, who taught her to hunt game and gather food and find self-sufficiency in nature. And there's another comparison. I'll mention that at the end. The indelible influence of We appears in later and equally classic works by authors who read Zamyatin. Two of the best known of these science fiction classics of dystopian thought are Brave New World from 1932 by Aldous Huxley and 1984 from 1949 by George Orwell. As American critic Neil Postman reminds us in 1985's Amusing Ourselves to Death, quote, Orwell feared that the truth would be concealed from us. Huxley feared the truth would be drowned in a sea of irrelevance. Orwell feared we would become a captive culture. Huxley feared we would become a trivial culture, end quote. The Hunger Games answers the question, which nightmare will win? Will we have a Huxleyan nightmare? Will we have an Orwellian nightmare? Well, Suzanne Collins weighs in on that question. And I think this is one of the reasons the Hunger Games is so remarkable. Because the Hunger Games answers that question, Huxley or Orwell, by saying both. The Hunger Games balances a Huxleyan nightmare in the capital with an Orwellian nightmare in the districts. Suzanne Collins provides her own 21st century take on this question. Allow me to illustrate how deftly the Hunger Games engages with these works. Let's start with Brave New World. In Brave New World, Aldous Huxley's futuristic Earth has a humanity mass-produced and custom-designed for assigned tasks. The historical Henry Ford, the American industrialist who sponsored development of the assembly line technique of production, is revered like a god. 10 world controllers of the world state, each of whom is addressed as his Fordship, reign over this highly stratified, tightly constrained, stagnant society. As the often repeated slogan goes in this Brave New World, everybody's happy nowadays. But what does this happiness entail? Huxley anticipates a shallow, hedonistic society in which citizens are entertained into mindlessness. They are the ultimate passive consumers, watching immersive multi-sensory films called feelies, playing ridiculous games such as centrifugal bumble puppy, engaging in meaningless recreational sex, and on frequent occasions, the cathartic group orgy-porgy, and disappearing into holidays in their own minds, courtesy of the hallucinogenic drug soma. They are not challenged by their work. They are not engaged in serious decision-making. They are not focused on anything beyond their own short-term, self-centered pleasure. They are dependent and thus easily led and controlled. Suzanne Collins' citizens of the capital share much in common with Huxley's citizens of the world state. Here is one example. The majority of those who live in the capital, they are consumed by the trivial, fad and fashion rule, making stylists, who are described by Katniss Everdeen as, quote, so dyed, stenciled, and surgically altered they're grotesque, end quote, celebrities in their own right. The capital citizens are also dependent. Katniss comes to realize that the capital dwellers are little more than ignorant, gullible, and dependent youngsters, no more responsible for themselves or the society they inhabit than an infant would be. In Mockingjay, she defends the remaining members of her capital prep team from the leadership of District 13, saying, quote, they're not evil or cruel. They're not even smart. Hurting them, it's like hurting children. They don't see. I mean, they don't know, end quote. Another example, the protagonists of both Brave New World and the Hunger Games, they're outsiders. In Brave New World, members of the public view John as wildly primitive because he grew up beyond their regulated society on a reservation, where behavior occurs that they see as beastly and which we, the readers, see as natural, such as the practice of sexual reproduction, the maintenance of family relationships, and the observance of cultural and religious rituals. The citizens of the world state deemed John the savage because of his so-called uncivilized origins. Similarly, Katniss in the Hunger Games is viewed as something different and less sophisticated because she hails from the primitive District 12. She defies capital aesthetics. The savage idea comes across clearly when members of her prep team fuss over her natural, that is, rough and hairy body. Once they have transformed her through waxing and plucking and scouring and scrubbing, Flavius announces, quote, "You almost look like a human being now," end quote. And they all laugh. This othering works both ways, of course. Standing naked before the stylists, Katniss knows she should feel embarrassed, quote, "But they are so unlike people that I'm no more self-conscious than if a trio of oddly colored birds were pecking around my feet," end quote. Because of this, John and Katniss, reflections of natural humanity, neither artificial nor altered, represent something alien. And therefore, the audiences from the world state and capital, respectively, view their lives and sufferings and even deaths without empathy. Huxley describes how Darwin Bonaparte, the Feely Corporation's most expert big game photographer, plants microphones and cameras around the home to which John has retreated to escape. He congratulates himself on getting footage of the savage, quote, "the greatest since his taking of the famous all-howling stereoscope Feely of the gorilla's wedding," end quote. John's private, personal anguish becomes the multi-sensory movie, The Savage of Surrey, quote, "seen, heard, and felt in every first-class Feely palace in Western Europe," end quote. It's entertainment. Likewise, in the Collins trilogy, the children of the districts are reaped for the Hunger Games so that their suffering can be broadcast as a warning and reminder to the people of the districts, of course, but also as entertainment for the citizens of the capital who place bets and follow the killings as if they're watching a sports competition. Here's the twist in the Hunger Games. Here's what Suzanne Collins is adding. When Katniss mourns her fellow tribute, Rue, and treats Rue's dead body with love and respect, she takes a first step toward forcing the audience from the Capitol to recognize the tribute's inherent humanity. She makes Rue's life and death abruptly real for the Capitol viewers. Here's one more example. Individuals fare similarly, that is, poorly, in the dystopias of Huxley and Collins. For example, in Brave New World, the few independent minds who rise above the ranks of conformity are punished. Huxley gives us the gifted Helmholtz Watson, handsome and brilliant lecturer at the College of Emotional Engineering. He rebels at the stifling prospect of writing endless and artless propaganda for the world state. Instead, he tries to encourage others to think for themselves, reading his students forbidden work on the heretical virtues of solitude and helping John destroy rations of the brain-numbing soma drug, knowing that he's ensuring his own downfall in the process. Ultimately, his Fordship, Mustafa Mond, permanently banishes Watson, but gives him the choice of which island will serve as his long-term prison. Watson chooses the inhospitable climate of the Falkland Islands for the sake of his art. Quote, "I believe one would write better if the climate were bad, if there were a lot of wind and storms, for example," end quote. Collins gives us something similar. Cinna, in the Hunger Games trilogy, is a product of his vapid capital culture, and yet Cinna rises above it. From the first moment Katniss meets him, she can see he is an independent soul because his appearance reflects his own aesthetic taste rather than the current popular fad. His exquisite designs are also intentionally provocative and politically subversive. When Katniss's would-be wedding dress transforms into the defiant form of a mockingjay in Catching Fire, Caesar Flickman asks Cinna to take a bow before the cameras in acknowledgement of his artistic achievement. But Katniss thinks, quote, "And suddenly I am so afraid for him. What has he done? Something terribly dangerous, an act of rebellion itself," end quote. And Cinna pays for his nonconformity with his life. But here's the twist. Cinna appreciates the danger he courts in time to leave costume designs and encouraging words to help Katniss in her final fight against the Capitol. The key to the Huxleyan nightmare Suzanne Collins presents in the Capitol is choice. Huxley's society members choose happiness over truth. Did the Capitol citizens choose to relinquish their autonomy in favor of becoming dependent children? Well, they did. Remember, they chose bread and circuses. And they've had a steady diet of propaganda ever since, reinforcing that choice. But the Hunger Games gives us a twist. When enough members of the Capitol wake up to their dependent plight, and they decide to challenge President Snow and his regime, Plutarch, for instance, and Cressida and her camera crew, these characters help to bring about permanent change. What am I saying here? Alone, Aldous Huxley's John the Savage takes his own life in despair. But surrounded by allies, Katniss Everdeen, the Mockingjay, survives. Okay, we've talked about the Huxleyan nightmare in the Capitol. Let's talk about 1984 and the Hunger Games. In 1984, by George Orwell, the Britain of the future has emerged from a devastating nuclear war to become Airstrip One, a claustrophobic society whose rulers are symbolized by the ever-present image of an ever-watching Big Brother. Members of the populace are never truly alone. They are under surveillance in their comfortless barracks by not only their family members and neighbors, but also their two-way television sets to confirm that they are loyal and obedient. Citizens' knowledge is manipulated by a government that constantly rewrites both their distant history and their recent history to serve the function of pro-state propaganda. And their ideas are constrained by newspeak, a limited language designed to make traitorous, that is, independent, thoughts unspeakable, and therefore, ultimately, unthinkable. Here's a key point to make. Airstrip One does not represent the choice of the people. Instead, it represents the will of the powerful few imposed and maintained by fear and pain on the many. When the protagonist, Winston Smith, comes to appreciate the nightmare in which he's living and struggles to liberate himself, he is brutally tortured and twisted and finally broken. His tormentor articulates the primary warning of the novel eloquently when he says, quote, "Always there will be the intoxication of power, constantly increasing and constantly growing subtler. Always, at every moment, there will be the thrill of victory, the sensation of trampling on an enemy who is helpless. If you want a picture of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever." End quote. The same warning about what the power-hungry will do to establish and enhance their authority appears in the Hunger Games. Thus, President Coin in Mockingjay proves to be equally willing to sacrifice human lives in the cause of consolidating her power, as President Snow was. Let's look at some examples of how the Hunger Games engages with 1984. Daily life in District 12, and a majority of the rest of the districts in Collins's novels, shares many similarities with life in Orwell's Airstrip One. Buildings reflect shabby decay. The people exist in a perpetual state of want. They attend public rallies, and they view government-made propaganda films because they are required to do so. They labor in assigned industries to fill quotas dictated by the central government, but the products of these industries are insufficient to fulfill needs. Therefore, both Smith and Katniss turn to illegal black market alternatives until those options are taken away from them. Furthermore, in Orwell's dystopia, a person must not entertain any idea that questions or contradicts the state. That's a thought crime. People must not even look like that's what they might be doing, because that's a face crime. In the Hunger Games, Katniss notes the same thing is true in the districts. Quote, "When I was young, I scared my mother to death. The things I would blurt out about District 12, about the people who rule our country, Panem, from the far-off city called the capital. Eventually, I understood this would only lead us to more trouble. So I learned to hold my tongue and to turn my features into an indifferent mask so that no one could ever read my thoughts." End quote. Here is another example. Peeta's hijacking in Mockingjay, that is, his physical torture and psychological reconditioning in the Capitol, it clearly harkens back to Winston Smith's physical and psychological torture in the dreaded Room 101. Smith is told, quote, "We, the party, control all records, and we control all memories," end quote. Peeta's memories in the Hunger Games, they are refashioned to fit President Snow's designs until he doesn't know what is real and what is false. Smith is tormented so that he betrays his lover, Julia, and begs for her to be tortured in his place. Peeta is programmed so that he attacks his love, Katniss, and he tries to strangle her. In both instances, the rulers release their victims in order to send a message about the ultimate power the government wields over its people, power enough to break and remake each citizen. Smith becomes a warning. Peeta becomes a weapon. But here's the twist. Unlike Smith, Peeta in the Hunger Games trilogy is not fully broken by his physical and psychological torment. With the help of Katniss, he fights to restore and replace his memories and overcome his fear conditioning. Ultimately, he brings her not death, as the Capitol intended, but life, a life with him and the new life of the children they make together. And here is one more example on a related and musical note. Collins employs the song "The Hanging Tree" in her tale, much as Orwell repeats the song "The Chestnut Tree" in 1984. Now, Orwell, he did not invent the chestnut tree. It was a popular Glenn Miller tune at the time Orwell was writing his novel. But he changed key words that his readers easily would recognize. Romantic love and emotional attachment are forbidden in Airstrip 1 because no other commitment should come before each person's loyalty to Big Brother. Therefore, the original and familiar "Under the spreading chestnut tree, I loved you and you loved me" becomes, in Orwell's dystopia, "Under the spreading chestnut tree, I sold you and you sold me." This selling, this speaks to how, in the end, Big Brother always wins. Smith and his lover each betray the other while in government custody. Collins echoes Orwell with "The Hanging Tree," not like Orwell's song "The Chestnut Tree," a reminder of how the state triumphs over everything, even love. "The Hanging Tree" is a subversive song about a man condemned to be hanged, calling to his love to join him so that the two can die together and be free. Only in Mockingjay, when Katniss has, quote, "a couple of trips to the Hunger Games under my belt," end quote, does she comprehend why her mother had wanted her to forget the song her father taught her and never sing it again. Katniss lives in a place where, quote, "plenty of people were executed," end quote, by hanging, whether they were actually guilty of offenses or not. Of the character singing the song, Katniss thinks, quote, "maybe his lover was already sentenced to death and he was trying to make it easier, to let her know he'd be waiting. Or maybe he thought the place he was leaving her was really worse than death. Didn't I want to kill Peeta with that syringe to save him from the Capitol?" End quote. The hanging tree, then, is the exact opposite of the chestnut tree. It's not about lovers selling each other out to the state. It's about love stronger than the power of the capital, stronger than even the survival instinct. It's about defiance and hope for something better. Both Orwell and Collins, in her depiction of the districts in the Hunger Games trilogy, describe a populace whose freedom has been taken away and trampled by force. The government maintains its authority through fear and violence. In his final passages, Orwell leaves us with the individual destroyed. But Suzanne Collins leaves us with individuals who are wounded and scarred, to be sure, but who have survived and outlived the powers that have oppressed them. In addition, Suzanne Collins adds her own ending note. Orwell, in 1984, leaves readers with a broken wreck of a protagonist, a beaten down and brainwashed servant of Big Brother. In Brave New World, Huxley's hero takes his own life. But Suzanne Collins gives us hope. In so doing, she brings us full circle back to the first great modern dystopia, Zamyatin's We. While it is true that We's protagonist finds no happy ending, in fact, only tragedy, Zamyatin does offer readers the promise of something more. Another character, pregnant with the protagonist's child, manages to escape the one state and find refuge beyond the wall in the forest. In short, the next generation will be born free. And this is where Suzanne Collins leaves us in Mockingjay, with the children of Katniss and Peeta playing freely and without fear in the meadow. The little girl and her brother, quote, don't know they play on a graveyard, end quote. Katniss and Peeta will never fully recover from all they have endured, but they will find joy in watching their children experience the kind of childhood they never had. And this brings hope. Their next generation can, quote, take the words of the song for granted, end quote. And those words are, here it's safe, here it's warm. What does this mean? In the Hunger Games, Suzanne Collins does her own thing with nuanced characters, complex and challenging moral dilemmas, and timely political and social critique. But she also gives us a work that addresses, respects, responds to, and adds to the dystopian tradition. How will our world go wrong, we ask? Like Huxley's Brave New World? Like Orwell's 1984? In her powerful, relevant story, timely, now, and built on classical and classic foundations. Her interrogation of the nature of power, propaganda, control, and the need for resistance, Suzanne Collins gives us an answer that is also a call to action. Our world can go wrong in both Huxleyan and Orwellian ways, but it can also be saved. And there you have my pitch. I hope that you will read or reread The Hunger Games. Thank you. May the odds be ever in your favor.